My name is Dr. Aldridge, Psychiatrist, and for 11 years I have devoted my life to understanding the labyrinth of the human mind. On paper, my career might appear enviable. Trained at Harvard, respected in Boston's medical circles, often consulted on complex cases others could not resolve. But beneath the facade of accolades and research papers lies a truth I rarely allow myself to voice. The mind can break in ways that textbooks never prepare us for, and when you spend your life wading through the fractures of others, those fractures begin to echo within your own. I have treated soldiers who returned from the Middle East, haunted by screams that only they could hear, women who stared at blank walls convinced that hidden figures breathed just beyond the plaster, children who spoke to shadows as though they were family. Each case left a mark, faint at first, but over the years those marks deepened, invisible scars etched into me as though I had absorbed fragments of their madness. My colleagues often admired my composure, but they could not see the restless nights, the sweat on my sheets, the whispers of my own subconscious that seemed to grow louder with every passing year. There is one night, however, that cleaves my life into two parts, the years before and the years after. A patient whose presence was unlike any I had encountered, not violent in the traditional sense, not delusional in the familiar patterns of schizophrenia or mania. His disorder, if one could even call it that, resisted the categories of medicine. He carried with him a weight that was neither chemical imbalance nor childhood trauma, but something older, darker, unnameable. I have told myself countless times that I should not remember his face, that it would be safer to let it fade. Yet it remains sharper in my mind than even the memory of my father's funeral, clearer than my own reflection in the mirror on sleepless mornings. There was something in his eyes that night, something I had no language for. A vacancy, yes, but also a cruel awareness, as though he recognized me long before I recognized him. When I first began practicing, I believed every patient could be reached, even those lost in psychosis. If I could only find the right words, the right medication, the right connection, there would always be a path back. That belief sustained me for years, a shield against despair. But this patient, this man, shattered it completely. After him, I understood that not all corridors of the human mind lead back into the light. Some descend so far into shadow that even those of us trained to guide cannot follow without losing ourselves. It is difficult to explain why I never spoke openly about what happened. I kept the official notes clinical, stripped of everything that made them real. The staff around me accepted my silence, attributing it to professional discretion. They never asked what I saw in him, what I began to see in myself after his sessions. Perhaps they assumed I had simply become another physician numbed by repetition. But the truth is simpler and more frightening. I could not speak because words diminished the enormity of what I encountered. And, if I am honest, I feared that giving voice to it would give it permanence, would invite it back. Boston nights are long in winter. The snow muffles sound, the streets seem to hold their breath. For years, I associated that silence with safety, a reprieve from the noise of the hospital. But after him, silence became a warning. I began to dread it, as though in the stillness something might finally emerge from the corners of my own mind. This is the story of the patient who broke the boundaries of what I thought possible in psychiatry, the man whose dreams infected mine, whose madness felt less like an illness and more like a passageway. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and from the night he first entered my office, nothing in my life has been untouched by the darkness he carried with him. It was late November, the kind of night when the wind sweeps through the alleys of Boston carrying fragments of conversations you cannot quite decipher. The hospital corridors were quieter than usual, their fluorescent lights flickering with the fatigue of machines that had burned for too many years. I was alone in my office when the orderly slipped the folder onto my desk. The man gave no explanation, no glance, as though he were eager to be rid of it. I remember the weight of the folder, heavier than it should have been, as if the paper itself carried something it was never meant to hold. The cover bore the simple label, Patient File 217. The number caught my eye. I had no particular superstition about numbers, but there was something in its symmetry, its coldness, that unsettled me before I had even opened the first page. I hesitated longer than I normally would, staring at the manila folder while the hum of the radiator filled the silence. Then, finally, I opened it. Inside were reports hastily written, as though the staff had wanted only to record enough to justify their actions without delving into detail. The patient's name was Ethan Caldwell, age 34. No prior psychiatric hospitalizations, no criminal record of note, only a few scattered references to insomnia, anxiety, and what his primary physician had once dismissed as vivid dreams, but the circumstances of his admission were far from ordinary. According to the emergency notes, Ethan had been brought in by police after an incident at his apartment complex. Neighbors reported hearing screams for hours, not cries of pain, but words shouted in tones that shifted from pleading to violent. When officers forced their way in, they found him in the center of his living room, standing motionless, drenched in sweat, muttering the same phrase over and over. He waits where the walls are darkest. What struck me most were the details the nurses had added after his arrival. Sedation had proven difficult. He fought every injection as though his body rejected the chemicals, yet when they finally subdued him, his demeanor changed instantly. He grew silent, watching the corners of the room rather than the people around him, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. One nurse noted that when she attempted to guide him to his bed, he whispered, "Not there." "He'll follow me." I had encountered paranoia countless times, patients certain that invisible pursuers lingered at the edges of their lives, but this was different. The language was too precise, too singular. Most delusions fracture into incoherence. Ethan's words had the weight of a testimony. They carried conviction. Flipping through the pages, I found sketches attached to the back of the file. They were not part of the official medical record. Someone, perhaps Ethan himself, had slipped them inside. The drawings were rough, done with a kind of pen found in hospital supply closets, but they were consistent. Every image depicted the same structure: a narrow corridor, walls stained, ceiling too low, a door at the end drawn heavier than the rest of the picture. Some pages showed marks along the walls, almost like fingernail scratches trailing into the dark. My first instinct was to attribute it to trauma. Hallucinations of corridors often appear in cases of severe anxiety or sleep disorders, but the more I examined them, the less they resembled dream fragments. They had the repetition of memory, as though Ethan were documenting a place he had returned to again and again. I closed the file after midnight, though the hospital was still awake with distant footsteps and murmured voices. For reasons I could not articulate, I slipped the folder into the drawer of my desk rather than leaving it on the pile for morning rounds. I told myself it was because I wanted to study it further, but there was another reason. Something about the file felt like it belonged to me now, a burden transferred. That night, as I left the hospital and walked through the frozen air, the city seemed more vacant than usual. The windows of the building stared back like blind eyes, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder with every block. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, the natural toll of long hours and heavy cases. Yet, as I reached my apartment and unlocked the door, I realized I'd been gripping the file inside my briefcase the entire way home, holding it as if letting go would invite something I could not name. The case had not yet begun, and already Ethan Caldwell was inside my life. The morning I met Ethan Caldwell, the sky above Boston was the color of lead, and the air carried the sharp taste of snow yet to fall. I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, unsettled by the hours I had spent awake, the restless turning in my bed, the sound of my own heartbeat loud enough to drown the silence. The file I had studied the night before still weighed heavily in my briefcase, though I had no reason to bring it with me. The case was already lodged in my memory in a way that others never had been. When they escorted him into my office, he did not enter as most patients did. There was no hesitation, no attempt to gauge his surroundings, no performance of nervousness or hostility. He simply crossed the threshold and stopped, standing in the center of the room as if the act of sitting were beneath him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, but none of that drew my attention. It was his eyes, pale, almost colorless, and fixed with an intensity that made the space between us feel smaller than it was. He spoke before I could. "Have you ever dreamed something that wasn't yours, doctor?" The question cut through the air, precise and deliberate. Patients often begin with fragments, with mutterings, with scattered thoughts I must piece together. But Ethan's words had no tremor, no disorganization. It was not a question meant to open dialogue. It was a challenge, an accusation, as though he already suspected the answer. I asked him what he meant, though my throat was dry. He smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with a kind of pity. "You'll understand." "Not yet." "But you will." The silence that followed was unbearable, as though something else lingered in the room with us. I gestured toward the chair, and after a moment, he lowered himself into it, his posture rigid, his gaze never shifting from me. I tried to guide the session toward his history, family background, childhood, work, but his responses were brief, evasive. He told me his parents were gone, but would not elaborate. He had held various jobs, none for long, dismissing each with the same explanation: "They don't let me sleep." When I pressed him to clarify, his expression hardened. "You think it's insomnia. It isn't. He walks the halls when I close my eyes. That's not sleep, doctor. That's trespassing." The words should have sounded like the ravings of a paranoid mind, yet the cadence in his voice unnerved me. He spoke not with fear, but with certainty, as though he had long accepted this reality and was weary of explaining it to those who could not see. He described the same corridor I had seen sketched in his file: the narrow walls, the door at the end, the marks etched into the surface, but he added details that had not appeared in the drawings. He said the air in that place was wet, heavy with a stench like rust and stagnant water. The door was always shut, but something beyond it whispered in tones he could not fully understand, though sometimes it spoke his name. Each night, he said, the door opened a little more. I should have maintained my clinical detachment. Yet as he spoke, I felt my chest tighten with recognition. His description mirrored the vague outline of the dream I had suffered days before, the dream I had dismissed as exhaustion. I reminded myself of probability, of the human tendency to find patterns where none existed. Still, the coincidence lodged itself in me like a splinter. At the end of the session, I asked him what he believed would happen if the door ever opened completely. For the first time, he looked away, his eyes shifting to the far corner of the office. His lips moved, but his voice was barely audible. Then it won't just be me walking there. The session ended abruptly. He rose without waiting for dismissal and left with the same silent defiance with which he had entered. I remained seated long after, staring at the empty chair, the faint indentation his body had left on the cushion. For years, my office had been a sanctuary, a place where I could measure the unmeasurable with calm precision. That morning, however, it felt altered, as though Ethan had left behind more than the echo of his words. I opened my notes and began to write, but the pen trembled in my hand. My entries were short, clinical phrases, patient exhibits, signs of paranoid ideation, possible delusional disorder with dream-related hallucinations. But the words looked false even as I recorded them. Nothing in my textbooks had prepared me for the weight of his presence, the sharp clarity of his madness, or the dreadful possibility that he had not asked me a question out of curiosity. The first nights after meeting Ethan were restless in a way that felt unnatural, as though sleep itself had grown hostile. I would lie in bed, waiting for the steady weight of unconsciousness, but instead of drifting, I felt myself dragged downward. It was not the gradual surrender of ordinary dreaming, but a sudden drop, like falling into a pit I had not known was beneath me. And when I landed, I was not in the shifting, fragmented landscapes of the usual mind at rest. I was in a corridor. The walls were narrow, stained with damp patches that seemed to pulse faintly as though alive. The floor was uneven, the air thick with the metallic tang of rust and something fouler beneath it, like decay steeped in water. There was no sound except the rhythm of my own steps, which echoed unnaturally, multiplied, as if more than one pair of feet were walking. At the far end stood a door, its surface warped, its frame darker than the rest of the passage. No matter how far I walked, the door never seemed closer, always maintaining its distance, always waiting. I woke drenched in sweat, my throat raw as though I had been calling out, though no memory of words remained. For hours afterward, I sat by the window, staring at the quiet city streets below, unable to convince myself it was merely a dream. I told myself I was vulnerable, that Ethan's descriptions had imprinted themselves on my subconscious. Suggestion can be powerful, I reasoned. The mind can be tricked into borrowing images, yet the sensation that lingered in my chest was not borrowed. It was mine. The following day, during our session, Ethan regarded me with a smirk that carried no humor. "You've walked it," he said. No hesitation, no question in his tone. He knew. I denied it, though weakly, the words sounding hollow in the space between us. He leaned forward, his pale eyes locking onto mine. "It doesn't let go once it's shown itself. You think it's your dream, but it isn't. You've been summoned?" The air in the room seemed colder, heavier, though neither of us moved. I asked him to explain what he meant, to clarify who or what had summoned me, but Ethan only shook his head slowly. "It isn't about who, it's about where. That place needs doors, and you've opened yours?" I redirected the conversation, forcing myself into the clinical rhythm of structured questions, but the ground beneath me felt unsteady. Ethan described again how the door at the end of the corridor never opened fully, only a fraction more each night, as though time itself was counting down to an inevitable moment. When I asked what waited beyond it, he went silent, his gaze fixed on the corner of the office, lips pressed tightly as if refusing to name what he knew. That evening, I returned home determined not to sleep. I made coffee stronger than I ever had, opened medical journals, filled the night with the sterile weight of words and numbers. But exhaustion is a relentless predator. By dawn, I felt my head sinking, my eyes burning, the line of text blurring. I resisted, but resistance failed, and again, the corridor. This time I heard something, faint, scratching along the walls, like nails dragging through plaster. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was not constant. It moved, circling, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. I forced myself forward, and the air thickened as though breathing through wet cloth. The door was closer than before. Its surface shivered, not with wind or touch, but with a rhythm like breath. I woke, gasping, a sharp pain on my arm. In the dim light of my apartment, I saw red lines along my skin, 3 shallow scratches, parallel, as if drawn by unseen claws. They burned, though no blood had surfaced. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps I had thrashed in my sleep, struck the edge of my nightstand, clawed myself unknowingly. But none of those answers settled. The marks were too neat, too deliberate. The next time I saw Ethan, I intended to remain silent about it. Yet the moment I entered, his eyes drifted to my arm. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He only smiled faintly and whispered, "It's begun." From that moment, denial was no longer possible. I was inside his madness, or he was inside mine. The boundary had already broken, and the corridor waited each night, patient, inevitable. The human mind relies on boundaries, between waking and dreaming, between memory and imagination, between self and other. Without those walls, sanity erodes. It was only after meeting Ethan that I realized how fragile those walls truly were. I had always believed I could observe madness without absorbing it, as though my role as physician granted me immunity, but the first fracture appeared quietly, in the still hours after another sleepless night. I had fallen into the corridor again. This time there was no illusion of distance. The door loomed before me, swollen with dampness, its frame etched with lines that resembled claw marks. My feet dragged against the wet floor, though I felt no control over them. The scratching sound returned, but it was closer now, rasping just beyond the walls. I wanted to retreat, but my body pressed forward. The door trembled as if struck from the other side, and then, for the first time, I heard a voice. It did not shout. It whispered, my name. I woke screaming, my throat raw, sweat soaking the sheets. The sound of my own voice startled me. I had never before screamed myself awake. My pulse thundered as though I had been running, and for a long while I could not move. Only when dawn bled faintly through the blinds did I gather the strength to stand. I stumbled into the bathroom and splashed water on my face, but the mirror reflected something I could not explain. My own eyes, rimmed with red, carried the same pale vacancy I had seen in Ethan's. When I entered my office that morning, Ethan was already waiting, seated with uncanny stillness. His posture suggested patience, but his expression betrayed something else. Anticipation, as though he had known exactly how my night had gone. You've heard him now, he said. His voice was quiet, but there was triumph beneath it. He knows your name. I tried to dismiss the statement, to steer our conversation toward medication compliance and structured sleep routines, but my words faltered. I could not forget the whisper. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. You can't treat what doesn't want to be treated. You can't medicate a place. You think this is illness? It isn't. It's a passage. Once you've walked it, there's no return. I recorded his words carefully, though my notes betrayed nothing of my own unrest. I wrote as though describing symptoms, patient exhibits, auditory hallucinations, consistent with delusional framework. But I knew those words were false. What he described was not delusion. It was shared experience. That evening, against every instinct, I searched my old files. I remembered a case from years earlier. A woman named Mary Hensley, admitted briefly before vanishing without notice. She had spoken of dreams she could not escape, corridors that returned every night, doors that breathed. At the time, I dismissed it as psychosis. Reading her notes again, I felt a chill deeper than any winter night in Boston. Her words mirrored Ethan's almost perfectly. And in the margin of her final entry, scrawled in frantic handwriting, was a sentence I had overlooked before. He will need another to walk beside me. The phrase unsettled me so completely that I shoved the file back into the drawer and locked it. My rational mind clawed for explanation. Coincidence? Suggestion? The recycling of archetypal images within disturbed minds. Yet the coincidence gnawed at me. Two patients, years apart, describing the same structure, the same door, the same sense of being summoned. That night, I attempted to resist sleep. I drank bitter coffee, forced my eyes open with medical journals, told myself I would endure until morning. But exhaustion is merciless. At some hour past midnight, the weight of my eyelids overcame my resolve. The corridor returned instantly, without transition, as though I had never left. The door was wider open now, a sliver of darkness visible beyond the crack. I could feel the pull of it, a current drawing me forward. Then, in the gloom, I was no longer alone. Ethan stood beside me. He did not look at me. His eyes were fixed on the door, and with a calmness that hollowed my bones, he said, "Now you understand. He always needs two." I woke with my body rigid, my hands clenched so tightly the nails had broken skin. Blood dotted the sheets. I stared at the crimson stains in the pale morning light, and for the first time in my life as a psychiatrist, I admitted the truth I had always denied. This was not my patient's illness invading me. It was something larger, something ancient, seeping through a crack that had formed in both of us. The fracture had already begun. In the days that followed, my work became a blur of routines I could scarcely maintain. The other patients, those with depression, anxiety, trauma, felt suddenly distant, like echoes of a life that had already ended. I found myself moving through the motions of therapy, writing prescriptions, listening to familiar confessions, yet none of it seemed to touch me. My thoughts returned always, relentlessly, to Ethan and to the corridor that waited every time I closed my eyes. I began dreading not only sleep, but also wakefulness, for each carried its own form of captivity. It was during one of those restless nights, long after midnight, that I decided to search the archives in the hospital's sublevel. The basement held decades of paper records, some yellowed and brittle, stacked in endless rows of cabinets. I had been haunted for days by the memory of Mary Hensley, the woman I had once dismissed as delusional, whose notes spoke of the same place Ethan described. I needed to see if others had left traces, if this pattern extended further back than I wanted to believe. The air in the archive was stale, heavy with dust and the faint scent of mold. My hands trembled as I pulled open drawers, flipping through names and numbers. Hours slipped away in that silence, until at last I found what I had been unconsciously seeking. A folder dated 1978, belonging to a man named Charles Vance. The notes were faded, typed on a machine whose letters had begun to blur, but the words struck me like a blade. Vance described recurring dreams of a hallway without end, a door that grows heavier with each night. He insisted something lived behind it, something that whispered through the cracks. The attending physician at the time had dismissed the dreams as manifestations of obsessive-compulsive tendencies mixed with early dementia. But in the margins of the final report, written in the physician's own hand, there was a cryptic line: "Patient insists I was present in his dream, claims I stood beside him at the door." I stared at that sentence until my vision blurred. Decades apart, in different cities, with no connection to one another, these patients had described the same architecture of terror, and now Ethan was repeating it, with details sharper, darker, more insistent. The rational part of me strained to explain it. Archetypes, Jungian symbols, shared mythology manifesting in fractured minds. But deep within, I no longer believed it. The repetition was too precise, too exact. When I returned to my apartment at dawn, the city outside was still and pale, but inside my chest, the air felt suffocating. I opened Ethan's file again, laying it beside Mary's and Vance's. 3 different lives, 3 different decades, one same corridor. The sketches blurred together in my vision until they felt less like drawings and more like maps. That night, I fought sleep with everything I could muster, but inevitability claimed me. The corridor was waiting, as always. This time, the air pressed against me like water, thick and suffocating. The walls dripped with condensation, and the scratching sound was louder, more frantic, as though claws raked directly behind the plaster. The door was ajar now, the darkness within no longer hidden but yawning like an open mouth. Ethan stood at my side, his form clearer than before, almost luminous in the dimness. He did not look at me, but his words slid into the air like a confession. "She was here once. So was he. We all walk the same hall, but it only opens for some." I wanted to ask who he meant, but the whispering from the door drowned everything. It was not a single voice anymore. It was many, overlapping, speaking words I could not recognize, yet understood in my bones. They promised release, but not the kind a man desires. The door creaked wider, and the air shifted with the force of something immense preparing to step through. I tore myself awake with a violent jolt, gasping, the taste of iron sharp on my tongue. My sheets were soaked, my fingernails broken from clawing into the mattress. On my desk, the 3 files lay open, their pages scattered as though stirred by an unseen hand. And in that moment, I realized the archive had not given me clarity. It had given me confirmation. This was no isolated case. It was a pattern stretching across time, threading through the lives of strangers who had never met, yet all of whom had walked the same corridor. And now, the door was opening wider for me. By the time the 7th session arrived, my exhaustion had hollowed me out. I moved through the hospital as though my body were separate from my mind. My words to colleagues automatic, my gestures devoid of intent. Nights had become unbearable stretches of dread. Even the simplest act of closing my eyes felt like submission to something that waited with patience beyond human measure. I had learned that resistance was futile. Whether I welcomed it or not, the corridor returned, the door always nearer, the whispers always clearer. When Ethan entered the office, he carried with him a silence so dense it seemed to thicken the air. He did not greet me, did not sit immediately. He lingered by the door, studying me with those pale, merciless eyes. It struck me then that he looked stronger, though his body was as frail as before. The strength was not in his muscles, but in his composure. He carried himself like one who already knew the outcome of a game I had only just begun to play. At last, he sat, folding his hands neatly on his lap. His first words were not his own. They came in a tone I had never heard from him, deeper, metallic, almost vibrating against the walls of the office. "It does not wear my face," he said. His lips barely moved, yet the sound filled the room. "It only borrows." The sudden shift left me frozen. I had seen countless episodes of dissociation, voices that patients swore belonged to entities beyond themselves, but this was different. The air itself seemed to react to the sound, vibrating faintly in my ears. Ethan's body tensed, his shoulders jerking once as if some invisible hand had tugged at him. Then his head fell forward, and he began to mutter in a cadence that was not speech, but a chant. I rose from my chair, uncertain whether to restrain him or call for assistance, but before I could decide, his body convulsed. His limbs shook violently, his head snapping back with such force I feared his neck would break. His mouth opened wide, and a sound poured out that was neither scream nor word, but something raw, a tearing of air itself. The door to the office burst open. 2 orderlies rushing in. They pinned him to the floor, their weight pressing his body into stillness, but his eyes remained fixed on me even as he writhed beneath them, and from his lips, through clenched teeth, my name emerged. Not once, but again and again, whispered with a devotion so unsettling it felt less like speech than invocation. I barked orders: secure his limbs, increase the dosage, monitor vitals, words of a physician, a man of reason. Yet my voice trembled, because what I had heard was not a patient repeating the name of his doctor. It was something else, something calling me as though my name were a key. The sedative took hold after long minutes, his body sinking into stillness. though the whisper continued faintly until his lips stopped moving altogether. His breathing slowed, shallow but steady. The orderlies exchanged uneasy glances, then lifted him back to the bed in the adjacent ward. When the door closed and silence returned, I remained standing, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the pen in my pocket. I attempted to write the session's notes, but the language of psychiatry failed me. How could I describe a voice that had shaken the air, a convulsion that felt less like seizure and more like possession? I forced the words. Acute psychotic episode, dissociative features, potential catatonia. Yet each term felt sterile, dishonest. That night, sleep arrived faster than I had expected, dragging me without resistance. The corridor waited, unchanged yet somehow darker. The scratching had become pounding, as though countless fists struck the walls. At the far end, the door was wide enough now that shadows leaked through the crack like smoke, and standing before it was Ethan, but not as I knew him. His body was taller, his frame distorted, his mouth stretched in a smile that revealed nothing human. When I woke, dawn had already broken, but my body ached as though I had spent the night fighting against restraints. My sheets were tangled, my arms bruised with the marks of pressure, though no one had touched me. My name still echoed faintly in my ears, spoken not in Ethan's voice, but in that metallic resonance that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I knew then that my sessions were no longer mine. Something had crossed the threshold, and the barrier between doctor and patient had shattered. Whatever haunted Ethan, Caldwell had already found its way to me. The first time I saw Ethan inside the dream, he was no longer merely a patient. He stood beside me as though he belonged to that place, as though the corridor itself had summoned him there to wait for my arrival. His presence did not shock me. What unsettled me was the sense that I had been expected. It was not a dream I had stumbled into. It was a meeting. The air was thicker than ever, oppressive and humid, carrying the sour scent of stagnant water. The walls glistened as though something seeped through them, slow and steady. The sound of our footsteps echoed in strange patterns, reverberating with a rhythm not our own. Ethan walked at my side, his expression calm, almost serene, his eyes fixed on the door that loomed ahead. "You understand now," he said quietly, his voice stripped of urgency, as if he spoke only to confirm what I already knew. It was never mine alone. He always chooses two. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The corridor seemed to absorb sound, swallowing my voice before it reached the air. Ethan did not look at me. His gaze remained forward, unwavering, fixed on the door that was now wider open than I had ever seen. A dark slit cut through its center, and from beyond it, a wind exhaled, slow, deliberate, cold enough to raise the hair on my arms. The whispers came then, not muffled as before, but clear. They spoke in a language I could not recognize, yet meaning bloomed inside me as though implanted. Promises of freedom, of release, of knowledge older than the body, older than the earth itself. The voices wove together, countless tones speaking in unison, a harmony that felt both sacred and profane. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes, but the sound drew me forward. Each syllable seemed to pull at the marrow of my bones. Ethan stopped walking. His hand rose slowly, pointing toward the door. His lips moved, but the voice that followed was not his. It was that same metallic resonance I had heard during the broken session, vibrating in my skull rather than the air. "Step closer, Doctor. The door is not for me. It is for you." The darkness beyond the crack shifted, and something pressed against it. The wood groaned, splintering under a weight I could not see. Fingers, too long, too many, slid briefly through the gap before retreating. My chest tightened, my heart hammering as though it would burst. I forced myself to step back, but the corridor resisted, its floor slick, dragging me toward the opening. Ethan did not move. He only watched, his expression placid, as though this had always been my path, not his. I wrenched myself awake with a cry. My body twisted in sweat-soaked sheets, the taste of rust in my mouth. The clock beside my bed read 3:17. I am. My hands shook violently as I touched my lips, expecting to find blood, but there was none. Still, the taste lingered. The following day, Ethan looked different. He greeted me with a nod, as though we had met in an ordinary place, a casual encounter outside the hospital. When I asked what he remembered of the night, his lips curled into a faint smile. "We walked together," he said. "You heard them. That means it's begun." I pressed him for more, my voice harsher than intended. What had begun? What did the voices mean? But Ethan only shook his head, his eyes alight with something that might have been triumph. "It's not about answers," he whispered. "It's about the door. And when it opens fully, neither of us will stand alone." The session ended with silence, but silence did not follow me home. That night, every sound in my apartment felt amplified. The ticking of the clock, the settling of the pipes, the creak of wood. Each noise blended into the rhythm I had heard in the corridor, the cadence of countless whispers pressing against the edges of my consciousness. Sleep was no longer a matter of rest or choice. It was a summons, and I knew, with certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the door would not wait much longer. The morning they found Ethan Caldwell dead, The hospital was shrouded in a silence I had never experienced within its walls. Hospitals are never truly quiet. There are always footsteps, the murmur of voices, the clatter of carts. But that morning, everything seemed muted, as if the building itself recognized that something irreversible had occurred. The report came swiftly. Ethan had been discovered in his room at dawn, lifeless. The official cause was listed as suicide by strangulation, yet when I read the details, unease rooted itself deeper. The surveillance footage showed him seated on his bed through the night, his posture unnervingly still, no movement, no attempt to fashion a ligature, no visible act that could have ended his life. And yet, by the time the nurse entered, his chest no longer rose. His skin already pale with the stillness of death. I requested access to the footage myself. What I saw unsettled me more than I can admit even now. For 7 hours, Ethan sat upright, his eyes locked on the corner of the room, unblinking. The digital timer in the corner of the screen advanced, but he remained as a statue. Then, just minutes before dawn, something impossible occurred. His mouth opened. The recording carried no sound, but I watched his lips move deliberately, forming shapes I recognized without hearing. He was repeating my name. Again and again, his lips formed it, until his head tilted backward and his body slumped lifelessly against the wall. The staff wanted the matter closed quickly. Suicide was easier to accept than anything else. They spoke of stress, untreated psychosis, and self-inflicted suffocation. No one questioned why the body bore no marks of struggle, no bruises, no evidence of restraint. They did not ask how a man could stop breathing without any visible means. But I asked myself until my mind spiraled into places darker than I dared admit. That night, when I returned to my apartment, I did not even attempt to resist sleep. Exhaustion claimed me almost instantly. The corridor rose around me, the air colder than ever, the walls vibrating with the pressure of unseen claws. The door at the end now gaped wide enough that the darkness beyond no longer hid itself. Shapes shifted within it, too vague to name yet too real to deny. And there, beside the opening, stood Ethan. His body was whole, his posture composed, his face no longer gaunt with illness. He looked almost at peace. "You see," he said, his voice carrying easily through the heavy air. "I didn't leave. I crossed. Now it waits for you." Behind the door, the whispers surged, louder than ever, overlapping voices that pressed against the marrow of my bones. They did not merely speak. They commanded. I felt my body lurch forward, as if the dream itself had hands pulling me toward the threshold. I fought against it, my legs heavy, each step a betrayal of my will. Ethan extended his hand, not as comfort, but as invitation. I woke with a violent gasp. The sheets twisted around me like restraints. My throat ached, and when I touched my skin, I felt deep bruises along my neck, dark marks in the pattern of fingers. Yet I lived alone. No one had touched me. The following day, I was summoned to finalize the official notes on Ethan Caldwell. His file, once a weight in my briefcase, now lay on the desk of administrators who demanded closure. I wrote what they wanted. Patient expired by self-inflicted means. Case closed. But in my private notes, the words were different. I wrote, "He crossed through. I saw him. The doors open wider." For years I had believed psychiatry to be the science of the mind, the careful measurement of disorders, the treatment of chemical imbalances. But no medication, no therapy, no discipline could contain what had revealed itself through Ethan. His death was not an end. It was a passage. And every night since, I have felt the pull of that same passage tightening around me, dragging me closer to a place where death is not a conclusion, but an initiation. In the sterile language of the hospital, Ethan Caldwell ceased to exist on a cold morning in November. But in the corridors of my dreams, he waits still, standing by the door that will not stop opening. After Ethan's death, the hospital sought to erase him. Files were archived, his name removed from schedules, his bed swiftly reassigned to another patient whose troubles belonged to the safer vocabulary of medicine. Yet his presence lingered in ways no administrative order could silence. The other staff whispered about me, though never in my hearing. They noticed the way my eyes drifted during conversations, the tremor in my hands when I held a pen, the hollowness that had begun to consume my voice. They thought grief or exhaustion explained it. They could not know the truth. Ethan Caldwell had not left me. I kept his file hidden, locked inside the bottom drawer of my desk. Officially, it was closed, signed off with the stamp of suicide. But I could not accept that conclusion. Each page carried more than medical notations. It carried evidence of something that refused to remain confined. Alongside Ethan's sketches of the corridor and the door, I had gathered Mary Hensley's notes, Charles Vance's reports, fragments spanning decades. Together they formed a pattern, a sequence that did not end with Ethan, but culminated in him, and now, in me, nights became unbearable. The corridor claimed me without pause. The transitions between waking and dreaming blurred until I no longer trusted either state. The door was wider now, gaping enough that I could see movement in the dark beyond. Shapes pressed against the threshold, their outlines shifting in grotesque mimicry of human form. They did not yet step through, but I felt their hunger, their patience, They waited as predators wait, certain of their prey's eventual surrender. Sometimes Ethan appeared beside me, his form steady and his voice calm. He no longer spoke in riddles or warnings. Instead, he whispered with the familiarity of one who had already crossed. "It isn't fear that binds you," he told me once. "It's recognition. You've always belonged here. You only needed the door." I woke from that dream with tears on my face, though I did not know whether they were born of terror or resignation. My neck bore new bruises, faint but visible, as though unseen hands had brushed against my skin. The taste of iron lingered in my mouth for hours afterward. I began to dread the daylight as much as the night. In the quiet of my office, between sessions with patients who spoke of ordinary sadness, I sometimes heard it, faint whispers seeping from the drawer where Ethan's file lay locked. At first, I dismissed it as the trick of a weary mind, but soon the whispers shaped into syllables, syllables into words. They spoke my name over and over, patient, unrelenting. One evening, long after the hospital had emptied, I unlocked the drawer and stared at the file. The air in the office shifted, colder, heavier. I felt as though by touching the paper I was touching the threshold itself. My hand hovered, trembling, until I forced it away. I slammed the drawer shut and turned the key, but the whispering did not stop. It followed me home, into my apartment, into my bed, into the fragile silence of the night. I know now that the door is no longer content to wait within dreams. Its presence bleeds into waking hours, bending the boundary between what I see and what I imagine. Shadows linger too long in corners, reflections distort in glass, and sometimes, when the city is quietest, I hear footsteps echoing in rhythm with my own, though the streets are empty. Ethan's death was not an end, it was an exchange. He crossed through, and in doing so, left the door open for me. Each night it widens further, the darkness spilling like water through a crack too small to contain it. Soon it will no longer be a dream, no longer a passage glimpsed in sleep. It will be here, fully, undeniably. I tell myself I will resist, that I will not step forward, but resistance feels hollow now. The whispers grow louder, the pull stronger, the inevitability certain. And in the deepest hours of the night, when the city is silent and even my thoughts falter, I hear Ethan's voice closest of all, no longer distant, no longer a memory. "Now it's your turn to open the door.